The river wasn't supposed to hold death. Han Jaiti had built an empire on the certainty that he controlled everything, every transaction, every silence, every outcome. He had survived things that had ended better men. His rivals called him the dragon. His enemies stopped trying. His own men believed, quietly and sincerely, that he simply could not be killed. They had not accounted for the river. He had been in the water for what the doctors would later estimate was 40 minutes, though there were no doctors here. No chrome and fluorescent light. No machinery measuring the distance between alive and not. There was only the slow, brown current of a tropical river carrying him nowhere in particular, and the late morning sun pressing down on the water like it had no idea anything was wrong. His white shirt had gone translucent. The dragon tattoo that ran the length of his left arm moved with the current like it was trying to swim without him. His breathing, when it happened at all, was the kind that sounds like a question rather than a statement. Korea's most feared boss was dying in a river that didn't know his name. 300 meters upstream, Kiana Diallo was doing what she did every morning. She moved her bamboo raft with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been reading this river since childhood. The way the current pulled left past the second bend, the shallow patches near the eastern bank, where the mackerel ran thick before noon. On her back, Lami and Sami slept in the particular boneless way of infants who trust completely, their small bodies warm against her spine, the fish basket secured firmly above them, its catch glinting silver in the sunlight. This was her world, narrow, honest, and entirely hers. She saw the shape in the water before she understood what it was. Her paddle slowed, her eyes narrowed against the glare. A man face up, not swimming, the current moving him with the casual indifference it reserved for things that could no longer resist it. Every practical instinct she possessed told her to keep moving. The village elders had a saying about strangers found in the river, that the water took them for a reason, and wisdom meant respecting the river's judgment. Kiana had never been especially good at wisdom of that kind. She brought the raft alongside him in 4 strokes and reached down without ceremony, gripping the wet fabric of his collar with both hands, her knees finding the edge of the raft, her back taking the weight. Behind her, Lami stirred and opened her eyes, watching the unconscious man's face with the unnerving, owl-like calm she had possessed since birth, as though she was simply cataloging information for later use. Sami felt the shift in her mother's movement and whimpered once, her small fist tightening against Ayana's back. Ayana pulled. The man was heavier than he looked. He came out of the water slowly, the river releasing him with reluctance, and she dragged him onto the raft boards and sat back on her heels, breathing hard, her arms trembling with the effort. He was Korean. Young. His arms were covered in tattoos so elaborate they looked like armor, dragons and characters, and something that looked like a map of a world she had never visited. His shirt had 2 dark patches near the ribs that were not water. Ayana pressed 2 fingers to his neck, a pulse, faint and unreliable, like a candle in wind, but there. She looked at him for a long moment, at the tattoos, at the injuries, at the face that even unconscious carried something carved and unyielding in its bone structure. The face of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. Then she looked at Lami, who was still watching him with that unreadable calm. Then at the river ahead and her village beyond it. She picked up her paddle. Whatever this man was, whatever he had done, whatever world he came from, he was alive because she had chosen to reach into the water. That made him her responsibility now. The river had offered him to her, and she had accepted. She didn't know yet what that acceptance would cost. She didn't know that in Seoul, 3,000 miles away, a room full of dangerous men was already moving, already tracing the last known coordinates of Hanjaiti, already following a thread that would eventually lead them to this river, this raft, this village. She only knew the current, and the weight of the man behind her, and the small warm pressure of her daughters breathing against her back. It was enough to keep pad. The fish had been good that morning. Yana had pulled in 2 full baskets by the time the sun reached the height where the light turned white and the river went still, the kind of stillness that meant the mackerel had gone deep and the morning's work was finished. She had enough to cover the week's cooking oil, the twins' medicine from the village pharmacy, and perhaps, if the market price held, a small surplus she could fold into the tin beneath her sleeping mat. Small victories, the only kind that lasted. She was turning the raft toward home, her paddle finding the familiar rhythm of the return current. When Lami made the sound she made, when something required attention, not a cry, not a word, Lami was 8 months old and not yet in the business of words. It was a particular quality of stillness, followed by a single, sharp exhale through the nose. Ayana had learned to trust it, the way she trusted the river's color changes before rain. She followed her daughter's gaze downstream. The shape was caught in the slow eddy near the bend where two currents met. The place where the river collected things it couldn't decide what to do with. Driftwood usually, occasionally a lost fishing net. Once memorably, an entire wooden door. Not this. Ayana's paddle slowed to a stop, and she let the raft drift, closing the distance in silence, her eyes working through the glare. A man, face up. Arms spread in the unconscious generosity of someone no longer managing their own position. The current turned him slowly, almost gently, as though it had been carrying him a long time and had grown patient with the task. Behind her, Sami made a small frightened sound, that primal animal awareness that something in the immediate world was wrong. Ayana reached back, without looking, and pressed one hand briefly against her daughter's knee. "I see it," the gesture said. "I'm thinking." And she was thinking. Thinking with the particular clarity of a woman who had raised 2 infants alone on a fish seller's income and understood precisely the weight of every decision. A stranger, injured, the dark patches on his shirt visible now even at distance. A foreigner, from the look of him, which meant complications she could not afford in units she didn't have. The village elders would have opinions. The market women would talk. And her daughters were on her back. 8 months old, with no protection in this world except her judgment. Every sensible thought she possessed pointed the raft toward home. She paddled toward him instead. Later, she would not be able to explain it as anything more sophisticated than this. His chest was moving, barely, wrongly, with the mechanical stubbornness of a body that had not yet received the message that it was finished, but moving. While it moved, she could not leave. She brought the raft alongside him, gripped his collar with both hands, and pulled the dragon out of the river. The ceiling was made of woven palm. That was the first thing Han Jaiti registered, not pain, though pain arrived immediately afterward and announced itself comprehensively. But the ceiling, low, irregular, pale brown in the early evening light, filtering through gaps in the wall. He had woken in many rooms in his life. Rooms in Seoul high-rises with floor-to-ceiling glass. Rooms in Tokyo hotels with thread counts he could name. Rooms designed by people who understood that environment communicates power. This room communicated nothing, except that someone had built it carefully with very little. He assessed without moving. The habit of years arrive in consciousness before announcing it. The surface beneath him was a sleeping mat, thin but clean, covered with fabric that had been washed so many times its original pattern was a memory. To his left, a single window without glass, a piece of cloth serving as a curtain, the warm smell of river air moving through it. To his right, a low table holding a clay bowl of water, a folded cloth, and a small bunch of river herbs he couldn't name but recognized as medicinal from the smell. His shirt was gone. His wounds had been cleaned and bound with strips of fabric, tight, competent, the work of someone who knew what they were doing with limited materials. He moved his fingers, then his hands, then attempted to sit up, and discovered exactly how comprehensively the river had taken its toll. He made it to his elbows and stopped, breathing through it, cataloging. No weapons, not hidden, not removed, simply not present, which meant whoever had brought him here had nothing to take. No security, no lock on the door, which was a bamboo screen that wouldn't stop determination, let alone intent. No communication equipment visible. No vehicle sounds, distant river, birds, children somewhere outside. And beneath everything, the low, rhythmic sound of 2 infants breathing in the particular synchrony that twins develop before they develop anything else. The woman appeared in the doorway. She had changed out of the river clothes, wearing a simple wrap dress now, moving quietly, the way people move when infants are sleeping nearby. She carried a second bowl of water and stopped when she saw his eyes open, reading his face with a directness he hadn't expected. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was even, not frightened, which surprised him. He said nothing, watching. She crossed the room, set the bowl down, and sat back on her heels at a respectful distance, close enough to help, far enough to give him the dignity of space. The gesture was so precisely calibrated that he found himself recalculating her entirely. "You lost a lot of blood," she said. "You need water, and you need to stay still." Jaiti looked around the room again slowly. At the carefully repaired wall, the single cooking pot, the twins' sleeping mat taking up a quarter of the available floor space, 2 small faces turned toward each other in sleep. A woman with nothing had given him everything she had. The lion of Korea's underworld, for the first time in longer than he could remember, had absolutely no idea what to do with that. The market ran along the riverbank every Tuesday and Friday. Yana had held her stall in the same spot for 3 years, third from the left after the entrance gate, between the woman who sold palm oil and the old man whose dried peppers were famous across 4 villages. Her spot, her customers, her rhythm. She left Jaiti sleeping under strict instructions, delivered in the tone she used when the twins were being unreasonable, and made the 20-minute walk to market with Lami and Sami strapped to her back, and her smaller basket balanced on her head. Normal, everything normal, that was the plan. The market told her immediately that normal had already shifted. She felt it before she could name it. The particular quality of attention that moves through a small community when something has disturbed its surface. Eyes that held a half-second too long. Conversations that paused at her approach and resumed slightly differently afterward. Mrs. Akafer from the palm oil stall greeted her with a smile that arrived a beat late. By mid-morning she understood why. The rumors had already been circulating for 2 days apparently, before she had even found him. A wealthy foreign man, someone was saying. Injured, seen near the river road. The story had traveled the way all stories travel in small places, gaining details with each telling that had no relationship to fact. She kept her expression neutral and her hands busy and said nothing. What she couldn't control was the afternoon. They came to her stall near closing. 2 young men she recognized from the outer village roads. The kind who moved in the particular loose-limbed way of people, who had decided that other people's work was more efficient than their own. They didn't buy anything. They stood at the edge of her stall looking at her mackerel with the exaggerated casualness of people performing disinterest. Heard you pulled something interesting from the river, the taller one said. Yana wrapped a customer's fish without looking up. I pull mackerel from the river, same as every morning. Something bigger than mackerel this time. She handed the wrapped fish across, gave her customer a smile, and finally looked at the 2 men with the flat, unhurried patience she had developed across years of difficult conversations. I don't know what you heard, she said, but I have 2 babies and a fish stall. That's the whole story. They left, but they left slowly, which was its own kind of message. 3,000 miles away, in a sole office building, a different kind of attention was moving. A junior analyst stared at a satellite phone record, a last known location, and 48 hours of silence from a man who had never gone silent in 11 years of operation. He picked up his phone, called the number he was supposed to call in situations like this, and delivered his report in 9 words. The dragon is missing. We've lost the signal entirely. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Then the machinery began to move. The elders came at dusk. Yana had been expecting them since the market. In a village this size, secrets had a lifespan measured in hours, and she had already exceeded that by a significant margin. She heard them on the path before she saw them, the measured footsteps of people who had decided something and come to deliver the decision. 3 of them, Elder Mensa in front, which meant it was serious. He was a tall man who had governed the village's internal matters for 20 years with the combination of genuine wisdom and complete inflexibility. That made him both respected and exhausting. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. We know about the stranger, Yana. She didn't insult him by pretending otherwise. He needed help, I helped him. He is not from here. Elder Mensa's voice carried no hostility, only the weight of someone stating a principle they had no intention of negotiating. Whatever he is involved in, it does not belong in this village. You have children. You have a responsibility larger than your compassion. She thought about Jaiti that morning, sitting up for the first time, accepting the bowl she handed him with both hands in the Korean manner, without seeming to think about it, watching Lami with the expression of someone encountering something they had no existing category for. He can't be moved yet, she said. He isn't strong enough. 3 days, Elder Mensa said. Then he goes, with or without your cooperation. They left the way they came, quietly. Finally, inside, Jaiti was awake and had clearly heard everything. He said nothing about it. That was something she was learning about him. He processed information internally and completely before he allowed any of it to reach his face. She was beginning to recognize the particular stillness that meant he was thinking versus the stillness that meant he was simply conserving energy. This was the thinking kind. Sami was fussing. The low, irregular whimpering she produced when the atmosphere in a room carried tension she couldn't name but could absolutely feel. Yana lifted her from the mat, settling her against her chest, moving to the window with the automatic bouncing motion that sometimes helped. The curtain was open 2 inches. Later she would understand that those 2 inches were the problem. Sami's whimper crested into a brief, sharp cry, the sound carrying cleanly through the evening, ere the way sound carries near water, before settling again as Ayana adjusted her hold. Outside on the path, 30 meters away, one of the 2 men from the market stopped walking. He had been passing. She would always believe he had simply been passing. But sound travels at dusk with particular clarity, and a baby's cry is a specific, locatable thing, and the light through a 2-inch gap in a curtain is enough to confirm what a rumor had suggested. He stood for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction from home. The first betrayal cost exactly 3 seconds and 2 inches of open curtain. Jaiti heard them first. He was on his feet before Ayana processed what his movement meant, upright, one hand on the wall for support he would not have accepted 12 hours ago. His head tilted in the listening posture of someone whose survival had depended for years on hearing things before they arrived. How many paths out of this village? He said, not a question, a request for data. Yana was already moving to the twins. 3, the river road, the market pass, and the jungle trail north of the elders' compound. Which one do they know about? All of them. She had Lami up and was working the wrap around her torso with the fast, practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this 10,000 times. But the jungle trail is the one they won't use at night. It goes deep before it turns. Because people who grew up here know what's in there after dark. She looked at him directly. Do you need to know what's in there after dark? Something moved briefly in his expression. No. Good, neither do I take this. She handed him the smaller of the 2 cloth bundles she had already packed. She had packed them after the elders left, because she had understood before she let herself understand. If that made sense, which it did to her completely. Can you walk? He answered by walking to the door. The jungle trail began behind the cassava field at the village's northern edge, and disappeared almost immediately into a darkness that was absolute, and layered trees pressing close, the ground soft and uneven, the sounds of the village replaced within 50 meters by the dense, indifferent conversation of the jungle at night. Jaiti moved ahead of her, slower than he wanted to, faster than he should have. She could hear the effort in his breathing, controlled, deliberate, the breathing of someone managing pain through sheer insistence. He paused every 30 meters and listened before moving, mapping the darkness with a patience that had no impatience behind it. She followed with both twins, Lami on her back in the wrap, Sami against her chest in the second cloth, the bundle in her right hand, her left hand free for the trail. The weight was significant. It had always been significant. She had carried both girls this way since they were 4 months old, through market days and long water walks, and everything the ordinary difficulty of her life required. Tonight the trail was uneven, and the dark was complete, and Jaiti needed to stop every 30 meters. She did not slow down. At the 3rd stop, she came up beside him and he looked at her, at the twins, at the bundle, at the complete absence of complaint in her posture. And something shifted in his expression that she didn't have the attention to interpret right now. Left or right at the fork, she said quietly. He blinked, refocused. Left, the right elevation is wrong. She nodded and kept moving. Behind her, Sami slept against her chest, with the devastating trust of someone too young to know there was anything to fear. Yana walked faster. They had been walking for 2 hours when Jaiti stopped and didn't start again. Yana came up beside him and immediately understood why. The jungle had changed its sound, not gone quiet, which would have been obvious, but shifted register in the particular way it shifts when something large and intentional is moving through it. The birds hadn't stopped. They had simply relocated their conversation upward, into the higher canopy, away from whatever was moving at ground level. Jaiti stood completely still, with his eyes closed. She had learned in 2 days that this meant he was working. That behind that stillness, an assessment was being built with whatever information was available. The same way she read the river's surface for what was happening underneath. He opened his eyes. 3, he said quietly, coming from the east. 1 looping north. He looked at her with the directness she had come to recognize as his version of honesty. They're trying to get ahead of us. Yana looked at the trail ahead, then at the twins, then back at him. There's a fallen fig tree 40 meters ahead. She said, equally quiet. The root system is large, deep enough. He understood immediately. Go. Don't come out until I come for you. You can barely. Go, Ayana. She went. The root system of the fallen fig was enormous. Decades of growth, creating a dense wall of tangled wood and earth that formed a natural hollow on its lee side. She pressed herself into it with both girls, adjusting her hold so Sami remained against her chest, and Lami was secure on her back. And she put her hand gently over Sami's mouth, not covering it, just present, a signal the child had learned, meant absolute quiet. Lami, facing outward over Ayana's shoulder, watched the darkness with her characteristic stillness. Jaiti did not fight the way people in this village understood fighting. There was no shouting, no warning. He simply used the jungle the way he used every environment, as information, as resource, as advantage. He knew where they were, and they did not yet know precisely where he was. And in his world that gap, however narrow, was everything. He was weakened. He knew it precisely and without sentiment, the way a navigator knows the fuel gauge. He accounted for it the way he accounted for all variables, by adjusting, not by pretending. It was over quickly and without spectacle. When he appeared at the root hollow, his breathing was harder than before, and he was holding his left side with a careful pressure that told her the wounds had objected to the evening's activities. But he was upright and his eyes were clear, and he held out his hand to help her up with the same steadiness he had managed everything. Ayana took his hand and stood. Over her shoulder, Lami watched him with her unreadable, ancient calm, and then, with the solemnity of a small person delivering a considered verdict, reached out one tiny hand and placed it briefly against his arm. Jaiti looked at the infant's hand on his tattoo. Something in his face went very quiet and very still in a way that had nothing to do with tactics. The ruin had been a trading post once. Someone had built it with genuine ambition, thick walls, a wide doorway facing the river trail, a second room that suggested optimism about future inventory. The jungle had been working patiently on it for what looked like 40 years, sending roots through the floor and vines across the ceiling, reclaiming it incrementally with the unhurried confidence of something that knows it will eventually win. What remained was dry, defensible, and invisible from the trail. Jaiti sat against the most intact wall with his legs stretched out, and Ayana's careful redressing of his side finished, and looked at the ceiling for a long moment in the particular way he looked at things when he was constructing something internally. Then he said, I need 20 minutes with a satellite connection. Ayana looked at him. I have one. He reached into the lining of his belt, a compartment she hadn't found because she hadn't been looking, and produced a device the size of a thick playing card. Matte black, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. The battery has been in water, but the casing is sealed. He pressed the activation point, and they both watched the small indicator light consider its options for 4 long seconds before deciding on green. He exhaled once quietly. She fed the twins while he worked. She didn't understand what he was doing. The interface was in Korean, and the logic beneath it was in a language of finance and leverage she had never had occasion to learn. But she understood the quality of his concentration, which was total and surgical, and completely without the uncertainty that had characterized everything else about the last 4 days. This was his river. She recognized what fluency looked like in another person. He worked for 18 minutes. When he set the device down, his expression had changed in a way she couldn't immediately name. It's done, he said. What is done? He was quiet for a moment, looking at Lami, who was watching him from Ayana's lap, with her standard unnerving attentiveness. The people looking for us have a larger problem to look at now, he said carefully. Something that will occupy their complete attention for the next several weeks. And there is money moving to an account that doesn't exist yet. It will exist in 72 hours. In a name I'll give you, accessible from any regional bank. Ayana looked at him steadily. How much money? He told her. She said nothing for a long time. Outside, the jungle continued its indifferent conversation. Sami slept against her knee. Lami reached up and grabbed Ayana's finger with her whole fist. I pulled a man from the river. Ayana said finally, quietly, more to herself than to him. I didn't pull him out for money. I know, Jaiti said. And there it was. The thing that had been accumulating in him since the palm ceiling and the carefully washed fabric and the bowl of water left beside a stranger's mat. He had built an empire on the architecture of mutual self-interest. The belief that every transaction had a motive and every kindness had a price, hidden somewhere in its terms. This woman had pulled him from the river with twin infants on her back, and a day's catch to sell, and not one calculation behind her eyes. It didn't fit any model he had, which meant the model was wrong. They returned to the river at dawn. Jai-T had chosen the timing with the same precision he applied to everything. The light at that hour was particular, the river traffic minimal, and the people he needed to believe what was about to happen would be exactly where his 18 minutes of satellite work had arranged for them to be. He had explained only what Yana needed to know. She had listened without interruption, asked 2 precise questions, and then been quiet for a long time in the way she was quiet when she was deciding something. "The girls and I wait at the upstream bend," she said finally. "Yes, and you come to us after." A pause that lasted slightly too long. "Yes," he said. She had looked at him with those direct, river-reading eyes, and he had held her gaze steadily, and they had both understood, in the particular way of 2 people who have survived something together, exactly what was and wasn't being said. The river at dawn was copper and still. Jai-T stood at the bank, where Yana had first pulled him from the water, and looked at it for a moment that was longer than tactical necessity required. The current moved the same way it had moved when he was unconscious in it, patient, indifferent, carrying everything that was offered to it, without judgment or preference. He had one more thing to offer it this morning. The device had done its work through the night. The rival factions' financial signatures were now embedded in 3 separate transactions connected to the local syndicate's territory. Clean, credible, the kind of evidence that investigators find when they are meant to find it. The dragon's last known coordinates pointed here. The money trail ended here. Everything pointed to a confrontation at this river, between 2 factions that had been building toward one for years. All it needed was a conclusion. The small charges he had assembled from materials that had no business being as useful as they were placed precisely. Minimal, designed for effect rather than damage, a sound, a light, a fire that would burn itself out on the wet bank in 20 minutes, and leave behind exactly the physical evidence his 18 minutes of work required. He set the timer with 30 seconds on it. Then he walked into the river. Not far, chest deep, where the current ran strongest, where a man could let the water take him downstream and around the bend, to where a bamboo raft waited with a woman who asked nothing and gave everything, and 2 small girls who had watched him with more honesty than any boardroom he had ever occupied. Behind him, the river bank delivered its conclusion to an audience of birds and early morning water, and the distant sound of the city waking up 3 miles away. The dragon was dead. The river carried what remained of him around the bend, without ceremony, where Yana was waiting. 5 years changed the river's banks without changing the river. The water moved the same way it had always moved, patient and copper in the early morning light, indifferent to the businesses that had grown along its edge. The new dock with its clean timber planking, the storage facility with the corrugated roof, and the hand-painted sign that read Diallo River supplies in letters that Lami had painted with the focused precision she applied to everything. Yana stood on her motorized raft in the pre-dawn quiet and let the engine idle, the way she did every morning before the day's work began in earnest. Not because the morning required stillness, because she had learned, in the years since the river changed everything, that stillness was how you stayed accurate about your life, how you kept seeing it clearly instead of just moving through it. The business had grown in the way that honest work grows, slowly at first. Then, with gathering confidence, the account had been there, exactly when Jai-T said it would be, in a name she had chosen herself, accessible from the regional bank, where the manager had looked at the initial balance, with an expression she still found quietly amusing when she thought about it. She had been careful, methodical. She had used what she needed and built what she could, and reinvested the rest with the same reading the river instinct she applied to everything. 3 other women from the village worked for her now. Mrs. Akaffer's daughter handled the accounts on Tuesdays and Fridays. Lami and Sami had left for the university in the capital 8 months ago. She had stood on this same raft on the morning after they left, and been very honest with herself about how large the quiet was without them. Then she had started the engine and gone to work, because that was what you did, and because they would call that evening, and because the fact that they were there at all, in a top university, studying things she couldn't always follow, but listened to with complete attention, was the point of everything. Lami was studying environmental science. Of course she was. She had been reading the world with those calm, observant eyes since before she could speak. Sami was studying law with an intensity that surprised no one who had watched her move through the world with her particular fierce, reactive love of fairness. Yana had told them once about the man from the river. Not everything, the shape of it, a stranger she had helped, who had helped her in return, who was gone now in the way that some people are gone. Lami had listened with her standard careful attention and then said, "The river gave him to you." "Yes," Yana said, "and you gave him back." Yana had thought about the dawn bank and the copper water and the sound she had heard from around the bend, and what she had seen when the raft carried them quietly downstream, or thought she had seen, a figure moving through the shallows on the far bank, pausing once, not looking back. Something like that, she said. This morning, the river was particularly still. Yana throttled the engine down to its lowest setting and let the raft drift the way she used to drift it in the old days, reading the current, feeling the water's opinion of the morning. The dragon tattoos were long gone from this stretch of river. The stories had faded the way all stories fade, when the people who need them to fade apply sufficient resources to the task. But sometimes, on mornings like this one, she felt it, the faint warmth beneath her sternum, that had no medical explanation, the pulse that matched the river's rhythm a little too precisely to be coincidence. Some debts, she had decided, were not debts at all. They were just the river doing what rivers do, taking what is offered, carrying it somewhere it needs to go, and returning in its own time, in its own currency, something that couldn't have existed any other way. She opened the throttle. Diallo River Supplies had orders to fill, and a morning that was already golden and 2 daughters who would call it 7, and a life that fit her. The way lives only fit when they have been built rather than inherited. The river carried her forward. It always had. Yana Diallo had learned many things from the river. She had learned that the current always knows more than the paddler, that what looks like debris from a distance sometimes turns out to be the most important thing you will ever pull toward you. That the river takes, yes, but it also returns, in its own season, in its own quiet way. With interest, it never announced it was accumulating. She had learned that compassion is not weakness dressed in softer clothing. It is the most precise and powerful force available to a person with nothing but their own character to spend. She had learned that some people arrive in your life already broken in ways that have nothing to do with the river, and that the act of pulling them onto your raft, when everything practical and sensible tells you to keep paddling, is not naivety. It is the bravest thing a human being can do. The morning she received the letter, Lami and Sami were home for the university break. It arrived through the regional bank, routed through 3 intermediaries in the careful, untraceable manner of someone who had spent years being professionally unfindable. No name on the outside, no return address. Inside, a single folded page and a smaller envelope that she set aside. The page said, in handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow knew. The river kept its end of the agreement. I am keeping mine. The account has been renewed for the next 20 years, enough for whatever the girls need. And whatever you build next, I am well. I am somewhere the dragons don't reach anymore. I don't expect you to forgive the world I came from. I only want you to know that the morning you pulled me from that river, you pulled me from something larger than water. Some debts cannot be repaid, they can only be honored. The man you found. Inside the smaller envelope were 2 things. A university scholarship confirmation, international, fully funded, postgraduate in both girls' names, and a photograph she hadn't known existed, taken from a distance, clearly, by someone with a long lens and no intention of intruding. Her bamboo raft on a quiet morning, Lami and Sami on her back, barely months old, the fish basket above them, her face turned toward the water, reading the current. She didn't know when it had been taken. She understood, looking at it, that some people watch over the things they cannot stay for. She folded the letter carefully and held it for a long time in the early morning quiet of her kitchen, while her daughters slept down the hall and the river moved outside the window with its permanent, patient confidence. Then she set it down, stood up and started the kettle. There was work this morning. There was always work. The dock needed the week's inventory checked. A new supplier was coming at 9, and Sami had asked last night if she could shadow the accounts process before she went back. Something about wanting to understand the business from the foundation up, which was so entirely Sami that it had made Ayana laugh out loud at the dinner table. Outside the river was copper, and still and entirely itself. Ayana didn't save Hanjite because she knew what he was worth. She saved him because he was breathing. That is the whole story, and it is enough of a story to last a lifetime. If this moved you, if somewhere in these 9 chapters you recognize something true about what it costs to be kind in a world that keeps giving you, reasons not to be, then this story found exactly who it was meant to find. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the most powerful thing you own is your character. Not your circumstances, not your resources, your character. Subscribe to AfroKorean Grit Stories, where every story we tell is about ordinary people who chose extraordinary courage when it would have been so much easier to keep paddling. And before you leave, tell me in the comments, has a stranger's kindness ever changed the direction of your life? Or have you ever done something for someone that cost you more than you had? I read every single one, every time, without exception. The river is still moving, so are we.